In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join me in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithalex@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We live stream Headline Buster on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Beijing time and air the segment on TV at 11:30 a.m. on Fridays. So do join us during the live streaming and get in touch. We would love to receive and possibly read out your insightful comments. Of course, this week, our focus is on U.S.-China ties. When President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden held their first meeting virtually on Tuesday morning, Beijing time, both commented on the significance of bilateral ties. President Xi said the most important event in international relations over the past 50 years was the reopening and development of China-U.S. relations, which has benefited the two countries and the whole world. And the most important event in international relations in the coming 50 years will be for China and the U.S. to find the right way to get along. President Biden called it the most important bilateral relations in the world. But how to describe their talks, which went on for nearly 4 hours past midnight in the United States? U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who was present at the dialogue, called it incredibly direct, candid and straightforward in sections. The talks were also unique because it was the first time the two met bilaterally as presidents after two phone conversations in February and September this year and a series of meetings between their top officials in Anchorage, Tianjin, Zurich and the latest in Rome. They were also unique, the meetings, because the two heads of state have known each other for a decade and brought the warmth of old friendship to the table. Now, they also seem to think along similar lines, using transportation images to show the importance of collaboration. Chinese President Xi compared the two nations to two giant ships sailing in the ocean. He said it was important for both to keep a steady hand on the tiller so that they broke waves and forged ahead together without losing direction or speed or colliding. Now, President Biden compared to the relationship to a train, saying common sense guardrails were needed to ensure that competition did not veer into conflict and to keep lines of communication open. The presidential talks, held at a critical juncture as tensions simmer between the two countries, looked at a wide range of issues, from climate crisis and global energy security to protecting American workers and the Taiwan question. According to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, two principled consensuses were made. One is on the importance of bilateral ties and the other, the rejection of the thought of a new Cold War. So says the Chinese side. Let's take a listen.
Managing differences and sensitive issues is a constructive way to prevent China-US relations from getting derailed or out of control. It is only natural for our two countries to have differences. What matters is to manage differences in a constructive manner and prevent them from getting magnified or escalated. China stands firm in defending its sovereignty, security and development interests. It is important that the United States handle the relevant issues with prudence.
So says the Chinese side, really. What have, however, the media been saying? Are the reports fairly accurate, or are they tilting at windmills, as they often do when China is concerned? Remarkably, the media tone is almost uniform and reasonable to a degree. Most project that at least a step has been taken to address tensions and open the door for further communication. The New York Times said Biden and Xi pledge more cooperation but offer no breakthroughs. The Wall Street Journal reported that Biden-Xi cooled down hostilities in virtual meeting, and CNN described the meeting as a healthy debate but no breakthroughs in Biden's critical talks with China's Xi Jinping. So some positivity there, but what about breakthroughs? Actually, commentators on my show have actually said it depends on your expectations. Given the tension between the two sides, the fact that the two presidents met, even in cyberspace, was a breakthrough in itself. Susan Thornton, a former American acting Assistant Secretary of State, told me this the day after the virtual summit.
We're not really expecting to have a long list of deliverables. It was kind of different from previous summit meetings in that sense, where we used to prepare long lists of outcomes for the meetings. This was more of a kind of a level setting between the two leaders, I think, trying to retrieve some of that common understanding and common principles that we had, previously in the relationship and that have sort of eroded. And I think, finding the floor in the relationship, reiterating all of the common principles that we've had, kind of sending that signal of things that have not changed is almost more important than coming up with new things that we can achieve. But I think there will be things now that we can talk about and put in on the track, let's say, of resolution, or at least making progress on.
Despite the overall positive tone, some reports focused on what has been called the hottest of hot-button issues, Taiwan. Interestingly, the British media seemed particularly alert on this. The BBC said Biden-Xi talks, China warns US about playing with fire on Taiwan. And The Guardian continued with the warning theme, saying Biden-Xi virtual summit, leaders warn each other over future of Taiwan. I think this is missing the forest for the trees. Yes, Taiwan is an important issue, even deemed the most important and sensitive issue in US-China ties, according to the Chinese side. But the meeting was not just about Taiwan. And mutual threats or warning do not define the meeting. When you highlight this one aspect, you risk creating the impression that the atmosphere was tense, even hostile. But that was just not the case. According to Jake Sullivan, during his readout of the meeting the next morning, there was a genuine give and take between the two, and it was a big, meaningful step forward from just talking over the phone, and both leaders benefited from it. China has called the meeting, as I said, candid, in-depth, constructive, and fruitful. Does it sound like a shouting match or a warning match? This is definitely not Anchorage. It's true, the phrase, whoever plays with fire will get burned, did get quite some attention in the international media. It's true that the Taiwan issue has been the source of heightened tension recently, but I believe the whole point of the meeting was not to let differences, such as over Taiwan, derail bilateral ties. And both leaders emphasized this point. President Xi said both sides should keep differences under control, and Biden underscored the importance of managing strategic risks and the need for common sense guardrails to ensure competition does not veer into conflict. So a more appropriate headline may be Biden-Xi talks, both leaders warn against ties getting out of control, don't you think? This is at least how I look at the work of a journalist. Rather than simply amplifying negative aspects, we should also give people positive energy and hope. That is how society comes together and finds solutions to an issue that's been exposed. With that, it's time for a break, but we'll be back right after that with our distinguished panel to discuss other shifts in bilateral ties. What's the plan to tackle some of the more important issues? So don't forget to rejoin us or stay right here. Don't go away. Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point. Welcome back to Headline Buster, and I'm pleased to introduce our guests for the upcoming discussion. They are Dr. Yukong Huang, Senior Fellow with the Asia Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who's joining us from San Francisco, California, and Professor Pu Xiaoyu, Professor of Department of Political Science at the University of Nevada, joining us from Reno, Nevada, United States. The warmest welcome to both gentlemen on Headline Buster of The Point. So let me turn to Dr. Huang first. Immediately after the meeting, the renminbi jumped to a 5-month high against the US dollars. That can be said as an immediate reaction to the meeting between the two leaders. However, as I said, there have been some skepticism as to what kind of breakthrough really was achieved as a result of the meeting. How do you look at really what happened as a result of the meeting? Any breakthrough or would you term it in some other way?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, observers were not looking for a major breakthrough. They were looking for a toning down of the emotions, avoiding conflict, and I think that was quite successful. The economic issues are not easy to resolve. Not easy to resolve because from a Washington and US side, there are 3 different audiences. There's those who worry about trade deficits, and they focus on the tariffs, an agreement for China to purchase more. And the problem with that particular issue is that trade deficits really aren't a sign of weakness. And America's been running a trade deficit every year for 40 years. This has very little to do with China. So that problem is not going to go away. The second audience is the US business community. They're looking for better access to the market in China. They're not in favor of tariffs. They are concerned about unfair practices, protection of intellectual property rights. And on this particular score, there is, in fact, issues that can be resolved, and there's been a lot of progress. If you look at surveys, 70% of the US business community have said that the Chinese government's policies on protecting intellectual property has improved. And this compares with 47% 5 years ago. So there's actually progress being made, and there's more progress that can be achieved. And the issue is whether the Biden administration will focus on this, because I think this is a win-win type of area. There's a third area, and this is the problem, is the security establishment. But then they see this as a conflict between 2 powers. And technology, the sharing of technology, the transfer of technology is the major concern. And this is where I think the trade war and the tensions becomes a zero-sum game. Because when you look at it from a security angle, you're basically saying, I can only win at your expense and vice versa. If you look at it as an economic issue, both sides can make progress. So what everyone's hoping for is that the next step, moving on from this a virtual meeting between Biden and President Xi, is that there will in fact be more serious discussions about some of these economic concerns, about moderating the tariffs, opening up the markets, trying to deal with some of these security issues. So I see there is some potential. But you have a problem. There's political concerns on the US side. There are elections coming up in a year or 2. And there's also concerns about the Chinese system being focused on the Party Congress for next year being a major event. So in some sense, it's the politics that may actually prevent major significant progress from being made.
Interesting perspective. Professor Pu, what is your take of what come out of the meeting? Did it fall short on expectations or deliverables, or it is, as some people are saying, putting a floor to bilateral ties, which had been risking a free fall, a vertical fall in some people's eyes?
My opinion is that this is really above expectations. Although, I mean, one virtual meeting cannot solve long-term enduring problem between the 2 countries. But I think this virtual summit meeting, by the way, I think their atmosphere, chemistry was good, I mean, between the 2 leaders. I mean, really rebuild the highest level of communications between the 2 countries. That's number 1. That's very important. Second, the 2 leaders really got a chance to discuss their long-term vision for the 2 countries, how the 2 countries could get along with each other, despite all the tensions. And that's very important. And especially regarding Taiwan. Taiwan, by the way, is a political dispute. It's not a military dispute. I think this meeting provided the leaders a chance to clarify intentions from each side. And finally, in terms of deliverable, although there are not much real like a deliverable, but since two leaders, they pay attention to sort of rebuilding the relationship, that will generate a momentum for each country, so that bureaucrats and the lower level officials, they can engage sort of substantive discussions about climate change and other issues. Both countries could collaborate. I think overall this is really, from what I see, I mean, from expert community, I think many people welcome this summit meeting, or even virtual summit meeting. Yeah.
I guess that's why the Chinese side have said that the meeting has injected new impetus to bilateral ties. Dr. Huang, how do you look at the different ways of approaching meeting like of such importance? As you said, the three different audiences, right, which is very practical, which is very pragmatic, people looking for concrete deliverables. And maybe that explains why some US media or international media say there are no concrete, because you can't put your hands on anything that they have signed or any specific resolution to any particularly contentious issue, whereas for the Chinese side, it is important to set the tone forward. I mean, how do you deal with this most important relationship? Once you're able to do that, then you're able to smooth out all the differences. How do you look at the difference between the two approaches? And is the Chinese approach consideration being properly perceived or understood by the American general public?
Well, from an American perspective, we have to be realistic. Some 75% of the American public have fairly negative views of China, and that's a problem. And this negative view is within the Democratic Party, also the Republican Party. So there's also what I'd call a lack of flexibility that faces the White House in terms of moving forward. There are two major issues that are highlighted in the Phase 1 trade agreement. One was the tariffs, one was the commitment for China to buy more products from the United States. And the Biden administration has not indicated yet a willingness to lower tariffs, and they basically asked that China should honor its commitments to purchase the commodities that they signed to a couple of years ago. But my personal view is that there will be some flexibility being shown. There will be what I call exemptions to U.S. firms. Tariffs will be moderated in those areas where it's shown that these are not really security issues. So in some ways, you're going to see change, but the change is going to be below the radar screen. It cannot be highly visible. U.S. firms seek better access in China. It's an inaccurate perception in the United States. Many Americans believe that U.S. firms invest excessively too much in China, and that leads to job loss here in the United States.
Right.
Very few people realize that of the totality of the America's foreign investment, less than 2% goes to China. And it's actually, the question is actually the opposite. There's actually too little money flowing from America to China. And that's what I think is the major interest of the US business community, greater access. And again, there's been progress made. You've had greater financial flows. You've had Tesla establishing a factory in China. I think you're going to see in the coming months, certainly in the coming years, increasing foreign investment rather than a slowdown in foreign investment, because I think both sides are heavily motivated to actually building stronger bridges in certain areas.
Interesting. Professor Pu, what is your thought on this issue? I mean, how does more warmer relation, less hostility between the two sides translate into more concrete results for the American business community or for American consumers, as it is the explicit goal of the Biden administration that U.S. foreign policy is going to serve the interest of the American middle class. So looking forward, how will heightened warmer relationship concretely benefit the American business community and consumers?
I think one big challenge in U.S.-China relation is, I mean, with rising political tension, hostile narrative, there are sort of broad securitization of all kinds of issues, including economic issues. Like normally we think economic issues just economy, but now because of the security competition, that become problematic for a lot of government agencies. So I think manage security competition more prudently, that will help recover some of these kind of normal economic relationship between US and China. And also, by the way, also people to people ties as well, academic, technological, even journalism. I think that's all important. So I think lower the political tension, then create a space for develop or maintaining normal academic, political, academic, scientific, and business ties between the two countries. That's very important, I think.
It is very worth noting that this time the Chinese president specifically raised the three principles in U.S.-China ties, what China believes should be the guiding principles, which is peaceful mutual respect, first and foremost, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. China does not obviously want the word competition to define U.S.-China ties, which is what the United States, since Biden administration, has been doing in a very high-profile way. Dr. Huang, how do you look at the formation of Chinese principle on U.S.-China ties raised during this meeting?
I think you made an excellent point in terms of what President Xi emphasized. And I think he was referring to the fact that there are many people who speak on behalf of the US government, and they don't always say the same kind of messages. They're conflicting. And I think that's one concern from the Beijing side. What exactly is the US position on various issues, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's security, whether it's economic issues? Now, if you take economic principles, can you move forward in terms of fostering more collaborative relationships? And I think the issue is technology. Let me just give you an example. We have a lot of concern about 5G communications equipment. And Huawei is what I call the globally most competitive supplier. But US policy has been basically trying to keep it out of Europe and keep it out of the United States.
Right.
And I think we should look for something more tangible in terms of how do you deal with these kinds of security concerns without jeopardizing economic benefits to both sides? So, for example, one thing we can think about is that Huawei actually partners with a European company like Nokia to provide 5G services in Europe and the United States, to provide more assurances about security risks. Let me take another example. Europe last year negotiated a bilateral investment treaty. It actually addressed many of the same concerns that the American business community is facing. If China, United States, and Europe used that agreement, which has already been agreed upon, as a basis to address some of these kinds of economic concerns, I think you can actually move forward. So one of the things I basically talk about is that US-China tensions are difficult to deal with because you have a lot of great power rivalries at play. But Europe can actually play an intermediate step in bridging some of these differences and toning down some of these tensions. So I would think that this issue in the future is going to be more of what I call a global discussion. And I think that makes a lot of sense because China's always emphasized that they believe that a rules-based global system is in fact better for everyone.
All right, very interesting perspective. Professor Pu, what do you think is the significance of the three principles: mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation? Because if you want to have the kind of collaboration as Dr. Huang just mentioned, for instance, between Huawei and a European operator so that the potential security issue can be addressed, then wouldn't it be better if countries say, okay, we are going to, peacefully coexist instead of just competing against each other? Because in a lot of people's mind, competition is not always benign, is not always with a big friendly smile. Sometimes it's a zero-sum game. I win, you lose.
Yeah, I think ultimately the United States and China must find a way to get along with each other. So in a sense that I think the previous administration had some kind of narrative, almost like a regime change or like change China's domestic system, that really angered, I think, the Chinese side. I think the Biden administration now, although they talk about competition, but I think some of their officials also talk about the concept competitive coexistence. I noticed President Xi Jinping actually partially acknowledged that concept and emphasized the coexistence part.
Yes, but
And
added the peaceful part. But added the peaceful
exactly.
part.
So yes, I agree. So added the peaceful to describe coexistence. I think the United States and China will not agree with everything, but I think ultimately they gotta get along with each other, find some kind of framework, enduring framework they could work on. So I think maybe competitive coexistence could be some kind of framework. The United States still emphasize competition, but they will acknowledge coexistence. And China could further emphasize peaceful coexistence. This might be a framework that both sides eventually could emphasize.
I've heard comments which says, competition is there anyway, right? Between Europe, between the United States, or between China and the United States, between, many other blocs in the world. So competition is always going to be there. But if you define a relationship with the word competition, that's going to create a kind of impression, or, it's going to define a much more hostile or tense atmosphere rather than the kind of more friendly and productive or constructive atmosphere, which is much more needed in this world. You already have a lot of competition. You already have a lot of debates, a lot of conflicts. Dr. Huang, how do you look at this?
I think you've raised an important point about what do we really mean by competition. And I actually thought that President Xi characterized it quite well. Several months ago, he basically pointed out that competition should be used for the pursuit and support of excellence. You compete to make better things. You compete to become more efficient. You don't use competition in some ways to think about trying to destroy your enemy. And that's the issue. Competition is not necessarily a bad word. It's how you actually use competition. And people think actually that there is what I call a zero-sum game, that America can benefit only at China's expense, or China can only benefit America. Expense.
And that's the risk of imagination that the word competition can evoke in a lot of people's mind, right?
Correct. But if you look at Europe, United States, and China as three major powers, and you ask if they interact, they trade, they work with each other, is there an inherent conflict? And the answer, it is not, because each of these three major economic powers, they actually specialize in completely different products. America is basically an agriculture economy combined with high-tech components. Europe is basically high-quality manufacturers and some services. China more broadly is basic consumers goods and spare parts and components that go into the production process. Each of these three giants actually specialize in different aspects or what I call the range of products. And in fact, that kind of competition is one reason why the growth rate over the last 10 or 20 years was about 25 to 30% higher than it was 30, 40 years ago. So the rise of China did not cause what I call a decline in living standards, a decline in production or efficiency. Actually, the whole world has benefited. Somehow we've lost sight of it. We started thinking about it as a security issue.
Yeah, we have to leave it there. We ran out of time, but it's been such an interesting and inspiring discussion. Many thanks to my guests, Dr. Yukong Huang, a senior fellow with the Asia Program of Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, and Professor Pu Xiaoyu, professor of the Department of Political Science at the University of Nevada. Thank you very much.